At this point in this series, we have now established that a 360-day calendar did indeed exist, not just in the imaginations of our ancestors. They weren't just playing around or were stupid. They actually calculated the 360 days for the year because that's what it was. We have more than enough evidence now to support that. Which means at this point that if you would like to go against the concept of the 360-day calendar, you have one hell of a mountain to fight up, right? Because right now we have established that all cultures in the past at a very particular point in our history had a 360-day calendar, right? The evidence is there. There's nothing to argue about. At the very least, all of the histories, the legends, the stories, etc. from that particular period in time objectively exist. Why do I even have to say this? Why does this matter? Why do I bring it up? I bring it up because a lot of the, or all of the mainstream, I guess I will say, will rally and fight against this, even though the evidence is right there, right? So if you have every single ancient culture in the past calculating a 360-day calendar based off the moon, right? They all did it. Everybody did it. It's not like one or two cultures. They all did it, and they did it because it makes sense. Now, if the mainstream people want to ignore this, that's fine, and they do, and they will, but they can't say it doesn't exist. Now, I only say this and point this out because people in the mainstream fields of history and archaeology, etc., they ignore this. And because they ignore it, they are put in a position to where they are not operating with real evidence. But they have no problem telling us how it actually was, while they completely ignore how it actually was. Which means we find ourselves in a very interesting position. By that, I mean we find proof that the mainstream is generally wrong and they follow wrong trends. They don't follow the evidence, right? They will claim to be scientific. They will claim that they're, real historians and academics and they really pay attention to the evidence. Here's the proof that they don't. I only make this point specifically because I want everybody to be comfortable with not listening to those people who speak from authority, right? That's their entire claim, is they just have an authoritative speaking position. That does not mean they are right. And we as alternative researchers need to be comfortable with that. We need to be comfortable with pulling ourselves away from people in positions of perceived authority. So I only point that out to let you guys know that, it's okay to step away. You don't have to listen to those people. You don't have to listen to the other side either, but you do need to listen to the evidence, and that's all I'm presenting here, by the way. All right, that's enough schizobabble. So let's get back into Velikovsky leading off with his evidence. And remember, he's just pointing out real life evidence. There's no bias here, by the way. So please remember that. Everything that I'm telling you guys or I'm reading here or presenting, there's no bias. It's all just facts that have been discovered that we are looking at from a fresh perspective. All right, let's keep going. This next part of the book is called Disarranged Months. As a result of repeated perturbations, the Earth changed from an orbit of 360 days duration to one of 365.25 days. The days probably not being exactly in both cases. The month changed from 30 to 29.5 days. These were the values at the beginning and end of the century of the Battle of the Gods. As a result of the perturbations of this century, there were intermediary values of the year and the month. The length of the year probably ranged between 360 and 365 days, but the moon, being a smaller or weaker body than the Earth, suffered greater perturbations from the contacting body, and the intermediate values of the month could have been subjected to greater changes. Plutarch declares that in the time of Romulus, the people were irrational and irregular in their fixing of the months, and reckoning some of the months at 35 days and some at more, trying to keep a year of 360 days, and that Numa, Romulus's successor, corrected the irregularities of the calendar, and also changed the order of the months. This statement suggests the question: might it not have been during the period between consecutive catastrophes the moon receded to an orbit of 35 or 36 days duration? If, in the period of confusion, the moon actually changed for a while to such an orbit, it must have been an eclipse or a circle of a radius larger than before. In the latter case, each of the 4 moon phases must have been of 9 days duration. It is of interest, therefore, to read that in many sagas dealing with the moon, the number 9 is used in measures of time. This brings to light another problem that we find when we try to look at calendars back in the day. So not only do we find calendars of 360 days, but we also find calendars that are trying to catch up with the intervals between 360 and 365. So you start to find calendars that are like 355 or 361 or 350. There's all these weird dates in between. Now, mainstream latches on to all of those weird dates as if it's our ancestors just being monkeys and they're just trying to figure stuff out, I guess, but they're still too stupid to figure out the calendar. What's funny is that if there was a catastrophe situation that was crazy enough to alter, the moon's orbit and Earth's orbit, then this is exactly what we would expect to find. We would expect to find people trying to pinpoint the days of the year because that's kind of important, right? I don't think mainstream understands that our ancestors would, of course, have cared how long their year was. Like, time was just as important to them back then as it is nowadays, so trying to figure out what time it was of the year would have been a huge deal. So these people were right on top of it. The problem that we find ourselves in is that we don't have every single calendar that has ever existed, back in the day. We only have, bits and pieces of calendars that have survived throughout the centuries, or the millennia, I guess I should say. And because we only have, bits and pieces of the calendars, we don't have a perfect chronological, history of everybody's calendar. Because we're lacking that, when we do make finds, when anybody makes a find, doesn't matter if you're in the alternative side or the mainstream side, these finds can be easily confusing. Because if you are finding calendars all over the world of 359 days, 348 days, 359 days, the list goes on, and I've discussed that a little bit in some of the other shows. What do you do with that, right? It's confusing as hell. Why is it that all of a sudden, in a very particular point in history, all of civilizations are struggling to try to figure out their calendar? Right, this is something that it seems like they apparently had locked down at some point in time, because they don't talk about having problems with it prior to this. There's no issues. Nobody is taking millions of years to try to figure out their calendar. Instead, we find cultures now like panicking. They're saying, well, crap, something has happened, and now we have to figure out what the heck the year is made out of now. Like, this is a legitimate problem, not just for 1 or 2 cultures on the planet, but it's a problem for everybody. So everybody simultaneously suddenly has discombobulated calendars. Why would everybody suddenly have a messed up calendar? This is just more evidence for some sort of catastrophe that affected Earth on a cosmological scale. And not just Earth, but the moon as well. And if we listen to all of our ancestors and what they say, because they tell us what happened, it's not just Earth and the moon that are messed up, it's a lot of other planets as well that are getting messed up, whose orbits are being changed, whose orbits are being affected by one another's close calls with each other. It just goes on and on like that. So, if we want answers to why we have these different calendars, catastrophism is one of those things that shows that to us, right? Because what's the other explanation? What else do we have to look at for evidence purposes that would that would make sense that, hey, this is why all of our ancestors have messed up calendars. What would cause that? I mean, what else could do that? Because you have to have the Earth's orbit altered. You can't just have random calendars just because for fun. You can't just do that. And these guys weren't doing that. These people were not just pretending and making stuff up. We have no reason and no evidence whatsoever to believe that our ancestors just didn't understand the concept of a calendar and how to make one. It's exactly the opposite situation. This point in time in history, these people are panicking because they no longer know what their year is. It's the exact same thing that would happen today if we were affected in this way as well. So this is the kind of evidence that it's important to pay attention to and not gloss over. I know it's really easy to look at calendars like this and be like, oh, they're just dumb. They're just monkeys scratching their butts and banging their heads against the wall. They didn't know what they were talking about. Yeah, no, they did. There's no reason to believe they were monkeys. In fact, we have every reason to believe that these people knew exactly what they were doing. And if the problems like this happened, we would see the kind of situations that our ancestors have to deal with built into their legends and their stories and their myths. And sure enough, they're there. They're right there. So we need to pay attention to those. All right, moving on. A series of scholars found that 9 days was, for a while, a time period of many ancient peoples. The Hindus, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Chinese. In religious traditions, literature, and astrological works, 7 days and 9 days compete as the measure of the month's quarter. In the time of the Homeric epics, the 9-day week became prevalent in the Greek world. The 7-day week and the 9-day week are both found in Homer. The Romans too retained the recollection of a time when the week had been of 9 days' duration. The change from a 7-day phase to a 9-day phase is found in the traditions of the peoples of Romania, Lithuania, and Sardinia, and among the Celts of Europe, the Mongols of Asia, and the tribes of West Africa. See, that's crazy. All of these people, and their calendars are just completely ignored. Amazing. All right. In order to explain this strange phenomena in time reckoning, obviously connected with the moon, the suggestion was made that in addition to the 7th-day phase of the moon, a 9-day phase was also observed, which is a third part of the month. But this idea must be rejected, because a third part of a month of 29 and a half days would more nearly be 10 days and not 9. Yeah. Besides, the quarter-month phases are easily observable periods during which the moon increases from new moon to half moon, to full moon, and then decreases accordingly. But a 9-day period falls between these phases. Therefore, in view of the vast material from many peoples, we conclude that at one time during the century of perturbations, for a period between two catastrophes, the moon receded to an orbit of 35 to 36 days duration. It remained on such an orbit for a few decades until, at the next upheaval, it was carried to an orbit of 29 and a half days duration, on which it has proceeded since then. So that last sentence is extremely important for anybody trying to lock down true chronology, because what we have here is evidence, physical evidence in the form of calendars and, of course, the myths and legends as well. But the calendars are the important part, because what they represent here is that we have definitive proof at what point in time Earth finally found its final orbit, the orbit that we now know today. So we can now officially track the last point in time where Earth had an encounter with another planetary body, or bodies in this case. This is a point in time where we can definitively say, alright, the time of the gods have to officially be over if all of these crazy catastrophes are truly done. Now, there's still some more catastrophes that will happen later because the solar system, it's still trying to settle down. It's not just because the planets are no longer interacting with one another. That doesn't mean there aren't like tons of space garbage out there, right? There's all kinds of other problems that we run into down the line, but we no longer have any encounters with other planets. So if we continue to look at the myths and legends of ancient cultures after this point in time, we should no longer see any more major interactions with the planets. And sure enough, that is exactly what we find. We find that once the calendar officially changes over to 365 days, there are no more God interactions with Earth. Those times are done. And those times will, of course, lead up to kind of how we are now, right? The concept of gods in the sense that the ancients used to look at them, gods being planets in this case, those times are physically over. Those planets are no longer in the sky in our time as they were back in the day. So this helps corroborate the motions of catastrophism that our solar system went through in the past, 6, 7, 8, 10,000 years or so. Or in this case, just the last few thousand years. So these are all scientific data points that we can then lock in to our chronology timeline, and we can say, hey, look, the 8th century BC was the last time that our ancestors ever feared a planetary body. And sure enough, that's what we find, right? Nobody cares about Mars after this period of time. The concept of Mars being a god, a warrior god, will continue, but he is no longer punishing Earth, right? He is no longer fighting Venus in the sky. Those times are over. They're over because they're physically over. They're not happening anymore. And because they are no longer happening over time and over the generations, the stories just kind of fade out. If you no longer can physically look up at the sky and see Mars and Venus battling it out with electricity and stuff, how serious are you going to take that story if you're, 4 or 5 or 600 years after the fact? Right? Humans are very visual people. If we don't see it happening, it becomes difficult for us to believe that something exists. Well, sort of, I guess. There's all kinds of other psychological stuff you can talk about, but that's something else. But basically what happened over time is our ancestors no longer had a point of reference of the major cataclysms happening because it was over. Right? Their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma went through it. They have no attachment to that anymore. Yes, they might still see stuff going on in the sky, and yes, those ancestors, still had to deal with some things here and there as time progressed. But the days of the gods or the planets are done. They're over with. So all of those planetary or / gods, those stories, instead of being historical recountings, they just turn into, ancient myths and legends, even back then. And how can you blame them, right? How can you blame anybody? That's why I don't get mad at people necessarily, because a lot of the stuff that our ancient ancestors talk about does seem crazy initially. But like we're seeing in these videos here, for example, and all the research that I'm presenting here, there's tons of evidence that support that what these people saw and went through was real. This was not a joke. Like, this was their true history. This was not some sort of fictional legend. Anyway, so over time, humans just forget. Right? I mean, you can see that in your own life right now. Like, how much of your great-great-great-grandfather do you actually know about? Like, just ask yourself that question. What do you have of him? Right? He may have done some amazing stuff, but if there wasn't anything that carried that on, that information is just gone. So same thing here, but instead of, maybe a couple hundred years difference, we have 1,000+ years difference. Time destroys everything, right? So that's why evidence like these calendars are so important. It's not just important because it's interesting to see how people were thinking back then, but because it literally tells the story of catastrophism. So if we stay objective and we look at what the calendars are telling us and we corroborate those with the stories of our ancient ancestors, and then we look at the physical evidence on Earth for catastrophism, suddenly all of that stuff starts to line up and make sense. Now, I know it can be hard to swallow at first, but the evidence is the evidence, right? There's nothing else to say about it. The calendars are there. They corroborate with the stuff that everybody's talking about, and they also corroborate with the geological and physical evidence on Earth. So as we start to approach this calendar issue objectively, we start to find new answers to problems in chronology. Right now we can start to explain why certain civilizations just disappeared. They're just gone. Why certain areas of the planet that appeared to have been habitable at one point in time are no longer habitable. And these calendars are bullet points in that proof that help us explain what happened to them. All right, let's keep going. These perturbed months occurred in the second half of the 8th century, at the beginning of Roman history. What is more, we have actual dates like the 33rd day of the month cited in the Babylonian tablets of that period. Thus, the month, which was equal to 30 days, changed to 36 and then to 29 and a half days. The last change was simultaneous with the change of the terrestrial orbit to one of 365 and a quarter days duration. So that brings us to the end of this particular section. So what we can get out of this is that we can see how important the moon was to their calendar. So first of all, that's already interesting. And the sun is not exactly what we would call perfect, right? So 365 days and change, and then we also have to add a leap year every 4 years to keep us regulated, basically. Now, this concept of regulating the year to try to lock it down to some number was well known to all kinds of ancient cultures in the past, in all kinds of different eras. So right there, that already proves that these people were not dumb. So we really need to get out of the mindset that ancient people had no idea what they were talking about when they were making calendars. So that's a bullet point for ancient cultures being smart. These people were obviously dealing with calendar issues, and they were dealing with it well. I mean, look at what they have to do to try to get their year lined up. They're going through all of the calculations. They're making the changes that need to be made, and that's reflected in the historical calendar record as we go back in time. The problem is that if you're a mainstream person, or anybody really, I mean, how many people really study the calendars? Because they're so confusing. You look at these calendars and pretty much everybody just writes them off instantly because they don't line up with today. But if we take the perspective of these people were making calendars for their time period. What's funny is that I say that and people would be like, well, no kidding, of course they'd make it for their period. But then when you look at the calendars that they're making, then they're like, oh, wait a second. No, they're just stupid. That can't possibly be correct. You know, it's like, really? Come on. Let's give the guys the credit. The calendars that these guys were making back in the day, they were making them for the time that they lived in, and then they were dealing with the problems of trying to keep that calendar accurate. This kind of evidence is amazing, and once we look at it objectively, it paints a completely different picture of what our ancestors were dealing with. So let's put ourselves in the perspective of our ancestors were not stupid, they're not lying, and they were just reacting to their environment. So in this case, they're reacting to their environment changing by having to fix the calendar. So what could possibly change the calendar? So there's a couple points here, right? So we know that they were using the moon during this period of time for their main timekeeping piece astronomically. So that's interesting in and of itself. Why use the moon? Right? We now know today that, you know, the moon 29 and a half-ish days, that's not a great way to deal with calculating time because you gain an error pretty dang quickly, right? It would only take like a couple of decades to really feel the error of using a modern day moon for calculations. But back in the day, that does not seem to be the problem, at least for a period of time. We find our ancestors have a calendar of 360 days and it works for them for a few hundred years. Like, this is just solid, it's proven, they have it, the calendar is there. And then something happens to where now they have to readjust the calendar to make up for the new situation that has arrived. Now, the new situation that has arrived is catastrophic. So what happens during a catastrophe? Well, all kinds of crazy things are happening. Now, during this period of time, this would be where Mars and Venus are basically duking it out, you know, kind of close to Earth. We're not like directly in their path. It's more of a Mars-Venus thing, but we're close enough to be affected somehow by the Mars-Venus interactions over there. So when those guys are interacting, yes, Earth is having its own problems. Earth is definitely having earthquakes. Earth is definitely experiencing, meteorite showers and stuff like that as Mars and Venus pummel each other. But what also would happen is that the moon would also be affected. And they say that, right? The moon essentially tries to leave its orbit. And there's all kinds of stories during this period of time that talks about the moon trying to go and join, trying to go and help, trying to go away and go towards the Venus and Mars gods, right? And we'll cover some more of that stuff later. But those stories are all over the place. So if we take these stories as face value, if the moon literally was being pulled away, that would affect their calendar. Now, if the moon is being affected, then that means the Earth probably as well. And sure enough, the Earth is also pulled out of its orbit to where we end up getting the 365-day and change year. So if a bunch of alarm bells just started going off in your head because I'm talking about, the Earth's orbit being changed from where it was originally, and you're thinking, well, how the hell could humans survive this? There's no way humans could survive the Earth's orbit changing. Of course it could. Of course we could. No problem. Even the dumb idea of this Goldilocks zone thing that mainstream throws out there, even that concept gives us one hell of a wide berth, relatively speaking. So, of course the orbit of the Earth could be changed. Of course the orbit of the Earth could be pulled further away from the sun. And for all you people trying to figure out why the hell the environments change on planet Earth so quickly, as we have all the evidence for, here you go. I mean, if you pull the Earth away to where we add, 5 extra days to the Earth's orbit, I'm pretty sure that the ecosystem is going to feel that. And sure enough, that's probably exactly what happened. You want to know where all these ancient civilizations die out relatively quickly? People are like, oh yeah, the Mayans died out because of drought, or the ice, whatever. Like, where did the drought come from? What happened? How did this happen? Here you go, right? You pull the Earth back, all of a sudden the ecosystem is going to 100% be changed. And then, of course, you throw on top of that the fact that Earth's tilt was also created, and then, of course, the magnetic pole was shifted, blah, blah, all that stuff. There you go. I mean, there's your explanations for all of the reasons why these ancient civilizations die out the way they die out, quickly, with very little fanfare. Alright, I'm talking a lot. I'll end this here. We've gone through enough. We'll keep going in the next part.